Four-time WNBA champion, Olympic gold medalist, one of the greatest point guards to ever touch a basketball. Sue Bird's resume speaks for itself. But right now, none of that matters, because what she just said on her podcast has the entire basketball world asking one uncomfortable question. Does Sue Bird have a problem with Caitlin Clark? And before you scroll away thinking you've heard this story before, stop. This is different. This goes deeper than a snub, deeper than a graphic, deeper than who gets invited to which podcast segment. What just happened exposes something the WNBA establishment does not want casual fans to understand. And by the time we're done breaking this down, you'll see the pattern clear as day. Let's get something straight from the jump. This isn't about tearing anyone down. Sue Bird is a legend. Her 4 championships with the Seattle Storm, her 5 Olympic gold medals, her place in basketball history is locked and secured forever. Nobody can take that away. But legends aren't immune to criticism. And when a legend uses her platform to shape narratives in ways that don't match reality, we have to talk about it. Here's what happened. On a recent episode of A Touch More, the podcast Sue Bird co-hosts with soccer icon Megan Rapinoe, the conversation turned to the future of USA basketball. Team USA 2028, the next generation. The young players who will carry the torch when Diana Taurasi and other veterans finally step away. Normal topic, right? Except for one glaring detail that sent fans into an uproar. When discussing the rising stars positioned to lead American women's basketball into the future, one name was conspicuously absent from the conversation. One name that, by every measurable metric, should have been impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark. The same Caitlin Clark who just completed a rookie season that rewrote WNBA history books. The same Caitlin Clark who shattered attendance records coast to coast. The same Caitlin Clark whose games pulled television ratings the league hasn't seen in over 2 decades. Gone. Invisible. Like she doesn't exist. Instead, the spotlight landed squarely on Paige Bueckers, the former UConn star, the 2025 #1 overall draft pick, a phenomenal talent in her own right. But here's the thing that makes this uncomfortable. Paige Bueckers hasn't played a single WNBA game yet. Not one. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark just finished a season where she recorded 769 points, 337 assists, and became the first rookie in WNBA history to record a triple-double. Read those numbers again. Actually, don't just read them. Let them sink in. Because when you understand what Caitlin Clark accomplished in her first year, the decision to exclude her from a conversation about the future of American basketball stops looking like an oversight. It starts looking like something else entirely. Now, some people will say we're reading too much into this. It's just one podcast episode. They'll argue. Sue Bird can talk about whoever she wants. And technically that's true. But here's why that defense falls apart. This isn't an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern. A pattern that started before Caitlin Clark even played her first professional game. Remember the Paris Olympics? Remember when Caitlin Clark was left off Team USA's roster despite being the most talked about basketball player on the planet? The selection committee made their choice, and Sue Bird was part of that decision-making apparatus as a USA basketball ambassador. Diana Taurasi made headlines with her reality is coming comments. The establishment made it clear. Caitlin Clark would have to wait her turn. But here's what the establishment didn't anticipate. The fans had other plans. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto WNBA courts wearing Indiana Fever colors, something unprecedented happened. Stadiums sold out, not just in Indiana. Everywhere. Road games that typically drew modest crowds suddenly became the hottest tickets in town. In Phoenix, Mercury attendance spiked by triple digits when the Fever came to town. In Seattle, the Storm saw similar jumps. In Las Vegas, the reigning champion Aces played to packed houses specifically because fans want to see one player. The numbers don't lie. The 2024 WNBA regular season became the most watched in 23 years. Let that time frame register. 23 years. An entire generation of basketball had passed since the league saw viewership numbers like this, and the catalyst was undeniable. Every statistical spike, every attendance surge, every ratings boom correlated directly with Caitlin Clark's presence. But watch Sue Bird's podcast, and you think none of that happened. Watch the graphics. Listen to the framing. Count how many times Paige Bueckers gets mentioned versus how many times Caitlin Clark's name comes up. The math doesn't add up. And that's exactly why fans are furious. What makes this situation especially frustrating is the contradiction at the heart of it all. For years, WNBA veterans and advocates have pleaded for more attention, more coverage, more respect, more fans. They wanted mainstream recognition. They wanted packed arenas. They wanted television ratings that could compete with other professional sports. They wanted sponsors lining up. They wanted the world to finally pay attention to women's basketball. Then Caitlin Clark showed up and delivered exactly that. Every single thing they asked for, she brought with her. And instead of celebration, there's this. Instead of acknowledgement, there's silence. Instead of inclusion, there's exclusion. The hypocrisy is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. But here's where the story takes an even wilder turn. Because what happened on that podcast episode wasn't just about who got mentioned and who didn't. It was about how certain fans were characterized. And what Sue Bird and her guest said about Caitlin Clark supporters revealed something the WNBA establishment probably wishes had stayed behind closed doors. That's coming up next. And trust me, you're not ready for what they actually said. Here's where the mask slips. Here's where the carefully crafted public image starts to crack. Because what was said on that podcast about Caitlin Clark's fan base wasn't subtle. It wasn't coded. It was direct, dismissive, and deeply revealing about how certain voices in women's basketball view the very audience they claim to want. During a previous episode of A Touch More, guests appeared alongside Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe to discuss the state of women's basketball. Normal enough. But when the conversation turned to Caitlin Clark supporters, the tone shifted dramatically. Her fans were described as problematic, toxic, people watching women's basketball for reasons that supposedly clash with what the league represents. The implication was clear. These new viewers aren't real fans. They're interlopers, outsiders who don't belong. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe sat there nodding. No pushback, no clarification, no attempt to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't paint millions of people with the same brush. Just quiet agreement with a characterization that should have been challenged immediately. Think about what that means for a second. Two of the most prominent voices in women's sports, individuals who have built entire platforms around inclusion and growing the game, essentially co-sign a message that new fans aren't welcome unless they arrive on approved terms. The gatekeeping was blatant, and fans noticed. Let's break down the logic here, because it falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. For over 2 decades, WNBA players, coaches, and executives have asked for one thing above all else: attention. They wanted eyeballs. They wanted people to care. They wanted mainstream America to tune in, buy tickets, purchase merchandise, and invest emotionally in women's professional basketball. Enter Caitlin Clark. From her days at Iowa to her rookie season with the Indiana Fever, she delivered exactly that. Her collegiate games drew Super Bowl-level ratings. Her WNBA debut was the most-watched game in league history. When Indiana played on the road, opposing teams literally changed venues to accommodate demand. The Connecticut Sun moved playoff games to larger arenas. The Las Vegas Aces saw attendance surge. Teams that struggled to fill half their seats suddenly faced sellout crowds. These aren't opinions. These are documented facts. Nielsen ratings, official attendance figures, verified data that anyone can look up. So when Sue Bird's platform characterizes the fans responsible for this historic surge as somehow problematic, what message does that send? When millions of new viewers are told their motives are suspect, their presence unwelcome, their passion misplaced, what exactly is the expected outcome? Here's the brutal truth nobody in the establishment wants to admit. They didn't want these fans. They wanted different fans. Fans who arrived through approved channels. Fans who already aligned with specific ideological frameworks. Fans who wouldn't shift the power dynamics or change who get celebrated. What they got instead was an organic explosion of interest centered on a player who doesn't fit their preferred narrative. And that's the real issue, isn't it? Caitlin Clark's popularity isn't manufactured. It wasn't created in a marketing boardroom. It wasn't strategically developed through brand partnerships and carefully curated social media campaigns. It happened because people watched her play basketball and couldn't look away. It happened because her game is electric. Her competitiveness is infectious. Her story resonates with audiences who never cared about the WNBA before. That kind of organic stardom is threatening to establishment figures who are used to controlling narratives. When you can't take credit for someone's success, the next move is often to minimize it, to reframe it, to suggest it isn't legitimate or comes with asterisks attached. Look at how the conversation around Caitlin Clark has been framed since she entered the league. Every accomplishment comes with qualifiers. Every record gets contextualized. Every surge in popularity gets examined for ulterior motives. Meanwhile, other players receive praise without the constant undercurrent of skepticism. This is an imagination. This is pattern recognition. And the pattern is becoming impossible to ignore. Now, let's talk about Paige Bueckers for a moment, because this comparison is central to understanding what's happening. Paige is legitimately talented. Her college career at UConn showcased skills that absolutely translate to professional level. Her 2025 draft selection at number 1 overall by the Dallas Wings was well earned. Nobody is disputing her ability to play basketball at an elite level. But here's the uncomfortable reality. As of this recording, Paige Bueckers has 0 WNBA games played, 0 professional statistics, 0 head-to-head matchups against the best players in the world. She has potential. She has promise. She has projections. What she doesn't have is proof at the highest level. Caitlin Clark, meanwhile, just completed a season that included WNBA Rookie of the Year, All-Star selection, the first triple-double by a rookie in league history, an assist record that put her name alongside the greatest playmakers the sport has ever seen. Tangible, verifiable, historic accomplishments that happen in actual games against actual competition. Yet somehow, when Sue Bird discusses the future of USA basketball, Paige Bueckers takes center stage while Caitlin Clark gets erased from the conversation. The player with the resume gets overlooked. The player with potential gets elevated. Explain how that makes sense from a purely basketball standpoint. I'll wait. The answer, of course, is that it doesn't make sense from a basketball standpoint. It only makes sense if you understand that this isn't about basketball at all. It's about narrative control. It's about determining who gets to be the face of women's basketball going forward. It's about maintaining influence over a sport that's changing faster than certain voices can adapt. And the fans see it. They see every graphic that excludes Caitlin Clark. They hear every conversation that centers alternative players while minimizing her impact. They notice every subtle dig, every backhanded compliment, every pointed silence where acknowledgement should exist. But here's what Sue Bird and the establishment might be underestimating. These fans aren't going anywhere. They aren't waiting for approval. They aren't asking permission to support who they support. And their voices are getting louder by the day. What happens next could reshape the entire power structure of the WNBA. And the numbers that just came out prove exactly why the establishment should be worried. Let's talk numbers. Cold, hard, undeniable numbers. Because in a world where narratives can be spun and opinions can be dismissed, data doesn't lie. And the data surrounding Caitlin Clark's impact on the WNBA tells a story that no amount of podcast spin can rewrite. During the 2024 WNBA season, the Indiana Fever led the league in road attendance. Read that again, not home attendance, where a passionate local fan base might inflate the numbers. Road attendance, opposing arenas, cities that had no inherent reason to care about Indiana's rebuilding franchise. Yet when the Fever bus rolled into town, seats filled up, tickets sold out, secondary markets exploded with demand. In Phoenix, the Mercury saw attendance jump by over 150% for Fever games compared to their season average. In Seattle, the Storm experienced similar surges. In Atlanta, the Dream played to their largest crowds of the season, specifically when Indiana visited. The pattern repeated city after city, arena after arena. One player was a constant. One player was a draw. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's compare those numbers to teams featuring players who receive disproportionate media attention from establishment voices. Paige Bueckers, as we mentioned, hasn't played a WNBA game yet. But during the 2024 season, the Connecticut Sun, often touted as an elite franchise with championship aspirations, averaged significantly lower attendance than Fever Road games drew. Let that sink in. A team playing their own building with their own fans in a market they've cultivated for years drew fewer people than a visiting team with a rookie point guard. Angel Reese's Chicago Sky, another player frequently elevated in conversations about the league's future, finished the 2024 season ranked in the middle of the pack for attendance. Respectable numbers, certainly, but nowhere close to the phenomenon that followed Caitlin Clark from city to city. The difference isn't marginal. It's dramatic, and it raises obvious questions about why certain narratives persist despite evidence pointing in the opposite direction. Television ratings tell an even more compelling story. The 2024 WNBA season became the most watched in 23 years. Not incrementally more watched, dramatically more watched. Games featuring the Indiana Fever drew audiences that rivaled some men's sports programming. Networks that typically treated WNBA content as filler suddenly found themselves with ratings gold. ESPN saw its WNBA viewership surge by 170% compared to the previous season. Primetime matchups featuring Caitlin Clark regularly cracked 1 million viewers, a threshold that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Her playoff games drew numbers that exceeded opening round NBA games. A rookie in a league that struggled for mainstream attention was suddenly outperforming established franchises in more prominent leagues. These aren't cherry-picked statistics. These aren't isolated data points manipulated to support a predetermined conclusion. This is the comprehensive reality of what Caitlin Clark brought to professional women's basketball in her first season. Attention, money, momentum, everything the league had been begging for. Now let's contrast this with what Sue Bird chose to highlight on her podcast. When discussing the future of USA basketball and the young players positioned to lead the next generation, the focus landed on athletes who simply haven't produced comparable impact. Paige Bueckers, talented as she may be, has yet to demonstrate what she can do against professional competition. Her college career is impressive, but college and pro are different worlds. The WNBA has humbled countless college stars who couldn't translate their games to the next level. Yet Sue Bird speaks about Paige as if her coronation is inevitable, as if the work has already been done, as if the only thing remaining is for everyone else to acknowledge what's supposedly obvious. The confidence is striking given the complete absence of professional evidence to support it. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark sits there with receipts, actual games, actual stats, actual records, actual proof that she can perform at the highest level while drawing unprecedented interest. And somehow, she's the one left off graphics. She's the one excluded from future-focused conversations. She's the one whose fans get characterized as problems rather than solutions. The math doesn't add up unless you accept that something beyond basketball is driving these decisions. Here's another number worth considering: merchandise sales. During the 2024 season, Caitlin Clark's jersey ranked as the best-selling in the entire WNBA. Not top 5, not competitive with other stars. Number 1, by a significant margin. Fans voted with their wallets, demonstrating exactly who they want to support. Social media engagement follows the same pattern. Posts featuring Caitlin Clark generate more likes, comments, shares, and overall interaction than posts featuring any other current WNBA player. Her highlight clips go viral with consistency that other players simply can't match. The algorithm, often criticized for bias in various directions, responds to what users actually want to see. And users want to see Caitlin Clark. Sponsorship interest has followed the attention. Brands that previously showed minimal interest in WNBA partnerships suddenly came calling. Nike, Gatorade, State Farm. Companies recognizing that Caitlin Clark offers something rare, genuine crossover appeal, the ability to connect with audiences beyond traditional women's basketball demographics, the capacity to introduce the sport to people who wouldn't otherwise tune in. This is what growth looks like. This is what mainstream acceptance looks like. This is everything the WNBA has wanted for its entire existence, delivered by a single player in her first professional season. And yet, when establishment voices gather to discuss the sport's future, she becomes invisible. When graphics are created showing rising stars, her image doesn't make the cut. When podcast conversations turn to USA basketball and the next Olympic cycle, her name goes unspoken. The disconnect between reality and narrative has never been more stark. The gulf between what fans are showing with their behavior and what certain media figures are promoting with their platforms has never been wider. Something has to give. Something has to break. What most people don't realize is that this tension has been building since before Caitlin Clark ever signed her professional contract. The establishment saw her coming. They watched her college dominance. They witnessed the attention she generated. And behind closed doors, decisions were made about how to handle her arrival. Those decisions are now playing out in public. And the consequences might be bigger than anyone anticipated. The 2024 Paris Olympics changed everything, not because of what happened on the court, but because of what happened before Team USA ever stepped foot in France. A decision was made, a message was sent, and Caitlin Clark received it loud and clear. When USA Basketball announced its 12-player roster for the Paris Games, the basketball world expected certain names. Aya Wilson, the reigning MVP and dominant force in the paint. Breanna Stewart, the versatile forward with championship pedigree. Diana Taurasi, the legendary scorer, making what could be her final Olympic run. These selections made sense. These were proven commodities at the international level. But one name was missing. One name that had dominated every basketball conversation for the previous 18 months. One name that had single-handedly revived interest in women's basketball across America. Caitlin Clark was left home. The explanation from USA Basketball was polished and professional. The roster represented the best combination of talent, experience, and versatility for international competition. Tough decisions had to be made. Younger players would have future opportunities. The talking points were delivered with practice precision, but the basketball community wasn't buying it. Fans erupted. Social media exploded with criticism. Sports commentators across every platform questioned the logic. How do you leave home the most talked about basketball player on the planet? How do you exclude someone who had just generated more attention for women's basketball than anyone in recent memory? The backlash was immediate and intense. But what happened next revealed something even more troubling about how the establishment viewed Caitlin Clark and her supporters. Instead of acknowledging the legitimate frustration, certain voices within USA basketball circles doubled down. Diana Taurasi's infamous reality is coming comment made headlines. The implication was clear. Caitlin Clark was overhyped. College success wouldn't translate to professional dominance. She needed to be humbled before being welcomed into the inner circle. Sue Bird, serving as a USA basketball ambassador, remained conspicuously silent during the controversy. No defense of Clark. No acknowledgement of her accomplishments. No attempt to explain why a player generating historic interest for the sport deserved a roster spot. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than words ever could. The Olympics came and went. Team USA won gold as expected. The basketball was excellent. But something else happened during those Paris Games. Something the establishment didn't anticipate. Attention didn't transfer. You see, the hope from certain quarters seemed to be that once Caitlin Clark was removed from the equation, fans would naturally shift their interest to other players. Aya Wilson would become the new face of the sport. Breanna Stewart would capture mainstream attention. The established order would reassert itself, and the momentary disruption caused by a rookie guard would fade into memory. That's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. Television ratings for Team USA's Olympic basketball games were strong, but unremarkable. Social media engagement was solid, but not exceptional. The expected explosion of interest around other players simply didn't materialize. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark continued generating headlines despite not being in Paris. Her training, her preparation for the WNBA season, her marketing deals, her every move drew more attention than most of what was happening at the actual Olympics. The experiment failed. The establishment's attempt to demonstrate that women's basketball could thrive without Caitlin Clark at the center backfired spectacularly. And instead of learning from this, instead of adjusting course, certain voices have dug in deeper. Which brings us back to Sue Bird's podcast and the pattern that's become impossible to ignore. Here's what makes the Olympic snub relevant to the current situation. The same decision-making apparatus that left Caitlin Clark off the Paris roster is now positioning itself to shape Team USA's 2028 plans. The same voices that deemed her unworthy of inclusion 2 years ago are now discussing the future of American basketball as if she doesn't exist. When Sue Bird centers conversations around Paige Bueckers as the future of USA basketball, she's not just expressing a personal opinion. She's telegraphing intentions. She's signaling where the establishment wants the sport to go. And that direction apparently doesn't include the player who's done more for WNBA visibility than anyone in the last decade. The question nobody seems willing to ask is simple. Why? Why would people who claim to want growth for women's basketball actively minimize the person generating that growth? Why would advocates of the sport treat its biggest attraction as an afterthought? The answer lies in something deeper than basketball, something that touches on power, control, and who gets to determine narratives. For years, the WNBA establishment operated in relative obscurity. The league had its dedicated fan base, its passionate supporters, its core audience that showed up regardless of mainstream attention. Within this environment, certain figures became gatekeepers. They determined who got celebrated. They shaped which stories got told. They controlled the conversation because nobody else was paying enough attention to challenge them. Then Caitlin Clark arrived and changed everything. Suddenly, millions of new eyes were watching. Millions of new voices were participating in conversations about women's basketball. Millions of new fans were forming opinions that didn't originate from established media sources. The monopoly on narrative was shattered overnight. This terrifies people who built their influence on controlling that narrative. When you can't claim credit for someone's success, when you can't position yourself as a gatekeeper who allowed their rise, when you can't shape how they're perceived by the public, your power diminishes. Your relevance fades. Your voice becomes one among many rather than a definitive authority. Sue Bird's podcast episodes aren't happening in a vacuum. They're part of a broader effort to reassert control, to remind everyone that the establishment still decides who matters, to demonstrate that no matter how many records get broken or how many fans show up, the old guard determines who gets elevated. But there's a problem with that strategy. A big problem. The fans aren't listening anymore. Something shifted in women's basketball over the past 2 years. Something fundamental. Something irreversible. And the establishment still hasn't figured out how to deal with it. For decades, the WNBA operated on a simple model. The league produced content. Media outlets covered it. Fans consumed what was offered. The relationship was top-down. Information flowed in one direction. Narratives were created by people with platforms and accepted by audiences with limited alternatives. That model is dead, and Caitlin Clark killed it. Not intentionally, not through some calculated strategy. She killed it simply by being so compelling that fans started paying attention in ways they never had before. They started watching games more closely. They started following statistics more carefully. They started forming their own opinions based on what they observed rather than what they were told. Social media accelerated this transformation exponentially. When Sue Bird's podcast features graphics that exclude Caitlin Clark, screenshots spread across Twitter within minutes. When guests characterize Clark's fan base as problematic, clips circulate on Instagram and TikTok before the episode even finishes uploading. When narratives don't match observable reality, thousands of voices call it out in real time. The establishment has lost control of the story, and watching them struggle to reclaim it has become its own form of entertainment. Here's what makes this moment so fascinating from a media analysis perspective. The traditional playbook for minimizing a rising star simply doesn't work anymore. In previous eras, you could ignore someone into irrelevance. You could refuse to give them coverage. You could center attention on preferred alternatives. You could wait for public interest to fade naturally. None of that applies to Caitlin Clark. Ignore her, And independent content creators fill the void with coverage that reaches millions, refuse to give her attention, and fans generate their own content that outperforms official channels. Center alternatives, and the viewership numbers make the comparison embarrassing. Wait for interest to fade, and it only intensifies with each passing month. The rules have changed, but some people haven't updated their strategy. Sue Bird's approach on her podcast reveals this miscalculation perfectly. By consistently elevating Paige Bueckers while minimizing Caitlin Clark, she seems to believe she can guide public opinion toward a preferred outcome. The assumption appears to be that if enough influential voices repeat the same narrative, fans will eventually accept it as truth. But that's not how modern sports fandom works. Fans have access to the same statistics establishment figures do. They can watch the same games. They can see the same attendance figures and television ratings. They can compare what they're being told against what they're observing with their own eyes. And when those two things don't match, credibility evaporates. This is the trap the WNBA establishment has walked into. Every time they exclude Caitlin Clark from a graphic about rising stars, fans post her record-breaking statistics in response. Every time they characterize her supporters as problematic, those supporters demonstrate their passion through ticket purchases and merchandise sales. Every time they try to redirect attention elsewhere, the viewership numbers expose the attempt. The harder they push, the more obvious the agenda becomes. And the more obvious the agenda becomes, the less seriously anyone takes their commentary. There's a term in marketing for what's happening here. It's called the Streisand effect. Named after Barbra Streisand's failed attempt to suppress photographs of her home, it describes situations where efforts to hide or minimize information only draw more attention to it. By working so hard to keep Caitlin Clark out of certain conversations, the establishment has made her presence in those conversations impossible to ignore. Every omission becomes a story. Every snub becomes a headline. Every attempt to redirect attention confirms what fans already suspected. The coverage and non-coverage has become more significant than whatever narrative was originally intended. Sue Bird's podcast episode about Team USA 2028 was supposed to build excitement around Paige Bueckers and other young players. That was clearly the goal. Elevate preferred names. Generate buzz for upcoming seasons. Position certain athletes as the future of American basketball. Instead, the episode became a case study in everything wrong with establishment media coverage. The discussion shifted entirely to who was missing from the conversation. Caitlin Clark's absence dominated every reaction. The intended message was completely overwhelmed by the meta-message about exclusion and bias. This keeps happening, over and over, and somehow, the lesson never seems to land. Here's what makes the situation so frustrating for fans who simply want to enjoy women's basketball. The sport has never been in a better position. Attendance is up across the league. Television ratings are reaching historic levels. Sponsorship money is flowing in faster than ever before. Young girls are watching WNBA players and dreaming of professional careers. The growth is real, tangible, and accelerating. This should be a moment of celebration. This should be a time when everyone in women's basketball locks arms and embraces the momentum. Instead, we're watching establishment figures engage in petty gatekeeping that threatens to undermine everything that's been built. The infighting is exhausting. The narrative manipulation is transparent. The refusal to acknowledge obvious reality is insulting to fans who pay attention. And the worst part is that none of it is necessary. Caitlin Clark's success doesn't diminish anyone else. Her popularity doesn't take anything away from Paige Bueckers or Aya Wilson or Breanna Stewart or any other player in the league. The attention she generates lifts all boats. Every arena she sells out creates new fans who might discover other players. Every television viewer she brings and might stick around to watch teams she's not playing for. This isn't a zero-sum game, but certain people are treating it like one. And their behavior is starting to have consequences that extend far beyond podcast episodes and social media arguments. The real damage is happening behind the scenes. And what's coming next might shock everyone who hasn't been paying close attention. Let's talk about what's happening behind closed doors. The conversations nobody is supposed to hear. The tensions that simmer beneath the surface of polished press conferences and carefully managed public appearances. Because what's brewing in the WNBA right now goes far beyond podcast snubs and excluded graphics. Sources close to league operations have painted a picture of an organization at war with itself. On one side, you have business executives who understand exactly what Caitlin Clark means for the bottom line. They see the revenue projections. They watch the sponsorship deals multiply. They calculate the long-term financial implications of having a transcendent star who could deliver mainstream attention. For these people, the path forward is obvious. Embrace Clark. Maximize her visibility. Build the league's marketing strategy around her drawing power. On the other side, you have legacy figures and her allies who view Clark's rise as a threat to the existing power structure. Players who spent years building the league without mainstream recognition. Media personalities who carved out niches as authoritative voices in a sport few people followed. Organizations that establish hierarchies based on seniority and approve narratives rather than pure market value. These two factions are pulling in opposite directions, and the tension is becoming impossible to contain. The business case for Caitlin Clark isn't complicated. During the 2024 season, the Indiana Fever generated more revenue than at any point in franchise history. Ticket sales exploded. Merchandise flew off shelves. Local and national sponsors lined up with checkbooks open. The team's valuation increased substantially based purely on one player's presence. But the Fever aren't alone in benefiting. League-wide television contracts are being renegotiated with leverage that didn't exist 3 years ago. Networks that previously offered modest deals for WNBA content are now competing aggressively for broadcasting rights. The asking price has multiplied because executives can point to one player and say, "She delivers ratings you can't get anywhere else." This is the golden goose. This is the breakthrough moment the WNBA has chased for its entire existence. And instead of celebrating, certain factions are trying to undermine it. The question reasonable people keep asking is simple. Why? Why would anyone sabotage success? Why would establishment figures work against the very growth they claim to want? The answer involves understanding how power works in insular communities. For years, the WNBA operated as a tight-knit ecosystem. The same names circulated through player pools, coaching staffs, front offices, and media positions. Relationships built over decades determined who got opportunities. Loyalty to the existing structure was rewarded. Challenging established norms was punished. Within this ecosystem, certain figures accumulated influence that extended far beyond their formal roles. They became kingmakers, taste arbiters, the people who decided which narratives gained traction and which players received institutional support. Their power derived from scarcity. When nobody else was paying attention to women's basketball, being the loudest voice in the room meant being the most important voice. Caitlin Clark's arrival didn't just bring new fans. It brought new voices, new perspectives, new power centers that don't answer to the old guard. Suddenly, independent content creators with no connection to establishment figures were reaching larger audiences than traditional media outlets. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were forming opinions without consulting approved sources. The monopoly on narrative was broken. This is existentially threatening to people whose relevance depends on controlling the conversation. If fans can watch games and form their own conclusions, what value does establishment commentary provide? If independent analysts can break down statistics and performance, what role do legacy media figures play? If social media allows direct connection between players and supporters, what purpose do gatekeepers serve? The answer increasingly is none. And that realization is driving behavior that would otherwise seem irrational. Sue Bird's podcast positioning makes more sense when viewed through this lens. By elevating Paige Bueckers as the future while minimizing Caitlin Clark's role, she's attempting to reassert narrative control. She's signaling that the establishment still determines who matters. She's reminding everyone that access to approved platforms comes with expectations about messaging. But here's what the old guard doesn't seem to understand. Their platforms are becoming less relevant by the day. Traditional sports media is declining across every category. Newspaper circulation has collapsed. Cable television viewership continues its downward spiral. Legacy outlets that once commanded massive audiences now struggle for relevance in a fragmented media landscape. The assumption that establishment platforms still control public reception is based on outdated models. Meanwhile, new media thrives. YouTube channels covering women's basketball have experienced explosive growth over the past 2 years. Podcasts focused on WNBA content are multiplying rapidly. TikTok and Instagram creators are building followings that rival traditional sports journalists. The attention has shifted, but the establishment hasn't shifted with it. This creates an increasingly absurd dynamic. Legacy figures speak to shrinking audiences while pretending their influence remains unchanged. They make pronouncements expecting compliance, while new media voices reach millions with alternative perspectives. They exclude players from graphics, while fans create their own content celebrating those same players. The disconnect grows wider every day. And at some point, something has to break. What's particularly revealing is how the establishment has responded to criticism. Instead of adapting, instead of acknowledging legitimate concerns, instead of recognizing that the landscape has fundamentally changed, they've doubled down. The characterization of Caitlin Clark's fans as problematic wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. Delegitimize the opposition. Frame critics as bad actors with ulterior motives. Maintain the pretense that establishment voices represent the true fan base, while newcomers are interlopers. This strategy has backfired spectacularly. Every attempt to dismiss concerns has generated more attention for those concerns. Every effort to delegitimize critics has strengthened their resolve. Every insult directed at new fans has pushed them further from establishment control. The WNBA is at a crossroads. One path leads to embracing the moment and maximizing the opportunity Caitlin Clark represents. The other path leads to continued infighting, narrative manipulation, and self-sabotage that threatens everything the league has built. Which path will prevail? The answer might depend on what happens next with Team USA. And the 2028 Olympics are closer than most people realize. The 2028 Los Angeles Olympics are less than 3 years away. And the decisions being made right now will determine whether Team USA enters those games as unified champions or a fractured organization undermined by internal politics. Here's what most casual fans don't understand about Olympic basketball roster construction. The process begins years before the actual games. USA Basketball identifies target players. Development programs are structured around specific personnel. Team chemistry is cultivated through training camps and exhibition competitions. By the time the final roster is announced, the real decisions have already been made. This is why Sue Bird's podcast commentary matters beyond surface-level media criticism. When she positions Paige Bueckers as the centerpiece of Team USA's future, while excluding Caitlin Clark from the conversation, she's not just expressing an opinion. She's telegraphing institutional intentions. She's signaling which players the establishment plans to build around and which players they intend to marginalize. The 2024 Paris snub wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview, a demonstration of how the selection apparatus operates when certain players don't fit preferred narratives. And unless something changes dramatically, the same dynamics will shape 2028 roster decisions. But here's where the situation gets complicated. The 2028 Olympics will be held on American soil in Los Angeles, with a global audience watching. The pressure to maximize viewership and engagement will be unprecedented, and the player who demonstrably delivers those metrics might be impossible to exclude regardless of establishment preferences. Think about the numbers we've already discussed. Caitlin Clark's games generate ratings that dwarf typical WNBA viewership. Her presence sells out arenas across the country. Her social media engagement outpaces every other player in the league. When Team USA takes the court in Los Angeles, which player guarantees the largest American audience? The answer is obvious to everyone paying attention. This creates an impossible dilemma for the gatekeepers. Exclude Caitlin Clark again, and you sacrifice massive viewership for the most high-profile basketball event on American soil. Include her, and you acknowledge that the establishment's preferred narrative doesn't match market reality. Either choice represents a defeat for those who work to minimize her significance. The internal debates are already happening. Sources indicate that factions within USA Basketball are deeply divided on how to approach the 2028 roster. Business-minded executives argue that excluding Clark will be financial malpractice. Legacy figures counter that roster decisions should be based purely on basketball merit, conveniently defining merit in ways that favor their preferred candidates. What neither side will say publicly is that this argument has nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with power. Consider the composition of USA Basketball's decision-making structure. The organization includes former players, current coaches, and appointed officials who spent decades within the women's basketball ecosystem. Many of these individuals have personal relationships with the players under consideration. Many have publicly aligned themselves with certain perspectives on how the sport should be covered and discussed. Sue Bird's role as a USA Basketball ambassador places her directly within this power structure. Her influence extends beyond podcast commentary into actual institutional decision-making. When she consistently elevates certain players while minimizing others, she's not just sharing opinions. She's exercising power. She's shaping outcomes. This is what makes the pattern so concerning. The same voices that excluded Caitlin Clark from Paris are positioning themselves to influence 2028 decisions. The same narratives that dismiss her impact are being reinforced through media platforms with institutional backing. The same gatekeeping mentality that characterized new fans as problematic continues to drive strategic thinking. If the 2024 Olympics taught us anything, it's that the establishment will sacrifice public support to maintain narrative control. The backlash over Clark's exclusion was massive and sustained. Fans expressed their displeasure through every available channel. The criticism reached mainstream media outlets that typically ignore WNBA controversies. And still, the establishment held firm. Still, they defended the decision. Still, they showed no indication of reconsidering their approach. What makes anyone think 2028 will be different? The optimistic view holds that market forces will eventually overwhelm institutional resistance, that sponsors demanding maximum return on investment will pressure USA Basketball to include its most marketable asset, that television networks negotiating broadcast rights will insist on the player who delivers ratings, that sheer economic reality will force the establishment to abandon its preferred narratives. There's some evidence supporting this view. The WNBA's new media rights deal, reportedly worth significantly more than previous contracts, was negotiated in an environment shaped by Caitlin Clark's impact on viewership. Corporate sponsors increasingly tie their investments to specific players rather than the league as a whole. The financial incentives are aligning in ways that make continued exclusion more costly. But economic pressure has limits, and ideological commitment can override financial logic, especially when the people making decisions don't personally bear the costs. The pessimistic view suggests that the establishment would rather diminish the moment than share it with someone they view as an outsider. That maintaining narrative control matters more than maximizing success. That proving a point about who belongs and who doesn't supersedes common sense about audience engagement. History provides uncomfortable examples of organizations self-sabotaging to preserve internal power dynamics. Institutions choosing decline over adaptation when adaptation requires acknowledging that the old guard got something wrong. Pride overriding pragmatism. Ego defeating opportunity. The WNBA sits at exactly this crossroads, and the decisions made over the next 3 years will determine which path it takes. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What happens when a player's impact becomes too large to ignore, but the establishment remains committed to ignoring it anyway? We're about to find out. And the first signs are already emerging in unexpected places. The cracks are starting to show, not in subtle ways that require interpretation, in obvious, public, impossible to miss fractures that reveal just how divided the WNBA ecosystem has become. Start with the players themselves. While establishment media figures work overtime to minimize Caitlin Clark's significance, her actual peers tell a different story. Watch post-game interviews from the 2024 season. Listen to how opposing players discuss matching up against her. Count how many All-Stars have publicly acknowledged her impact on the league. Aya Wilson, the two-time MVP and consensus best player in the WNBA, has repeatedly praised Clark's game, not in backhanded ways designed to qualify the compliment, Genuine recognition of a player who makes the league better. Wilson understands something the establishment seems to miss. Rising tides lift all boats. Caitlin Clark's popularity doesn't threaten Aya Wilson's legacy. It amplifies it by bringing more eyes to the sport where Wilson dominates. Breanna Stewart, another perennial MVP candidate, has echoed similar sentiments. She's spoken publicly about the increased attention the league receives and acknowledged that certain players drive that attention more than others. Stewart isn't threatened by Clark's popularity. She's smart enough to recognize that more fans watching means more appreciation for everyone's talent. Even Diana Taurasi, whose reality is coming comment before the 2024 season seemed designed to diminish expectations for Clark, has walked back her stance. After watching Clark's rookie season unfold, after seeing the records fall and the crowds gather, Taurasi's tone shifted noticeably. The predicted humbling never materialized. Reality came, and it validated everything Clark supporters believed. This creates an awkward dynamic for establishment media figures like Sue Bird. The very players she presumably champions aren't participating in the marginalization campaign. They're offering respect and acknowledgement while podcast commentary offers exclusion and silence. The disconnect between player perspectives and media narratives grows more glaring by the day. But the fractures extend beyond player comments into institutional relationships that matter for the league's future. Sponsors are paying attention closely. Major brands invest in the WNBA expecting returns measured in visibility and engagement. When those brands analyze performance data, certain conclusions become inescapable. Content featuring Caitlin Clark outperforms everything else. Campaigns built around her generate more impressions. Products associated with her sell more units. This creates tension between what establishment voices want to promote and what sponsors are paying to see. Marketing executives don't care about internal WNBA politics. They don't care about legacy grievances or narrative preferences. They care about metrics. They care about ROI. And the metrics point overwhelmingly in one direction. Reports indicate that multiple league sponsors have privately expressed frustration with how Caitlin Clark has been covered by establishment-adjacent media. They've invested significant resources, expecting their association with the league to be amplified by its biggest star. Instead, they watch as certain platforms work to minimize their visibility while promoting alternatives with smaller audiences. This isn't sustainable. Eventually, money talks loudly enough that even the most committed gatekeepers have to listen. Television networks are experiencing similar tensions. ESPN and other broadcast partners negotiated rights deals based on projections that assume maximum exposure for the league's most popular player. When establishment media figures on those same networks participate in minimizing that player, it creates internal conflicts that executives are increasingly unwilling to tolerate. The 2024 season saw behind-the-scenes battles over coverage decisions. Producers who wanted to lead with Caitlin Clark content faced pushback from on-air talent with different preferences. Programming executives demanding ratings clashed with commentators promoting alternative narratives. The friction generated headlines of its own, further exposing the divide. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the upcoming contract negotiations across multiple dimensions of the WNBA ecosystem. The league's collective bargaining agreement with players, individual network broadcast rights, sponsorship renewals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. All of these negotiations are happening against the backdrop of the Clark controversy. Players entering CBA negotiations understand that their leverage comes primarily from the league's increased visibility. That visibility traces directly to Caitlin Clark's impact. Any player representative arguing for higher salaries or better conditions is implicitly relying on value Clark generated. This makes the establishment's minimization campaign even more counterproductive. You can't simultaneously credit the league for growth while refusing to acknowledge the individual most responsible for that growth. Sponsors approaching renewal discussions want assurances about future visibility. They want guarantees that the players' driving engagement will remain central to marketing efforts. When they watch establishment media figures exclude those players from coverage, it raises questions about whether the league can deliver on promises made during sales presentations. Networks evaluating future rights deals calculate value based on projected viewership. Those projections rely heavily on assumptions about which players will be featured and how prominently. If establishment figures successfully marginalize the league's biggest ratings driver, those projections need revision, downward revision, with corresponding decreases in what networks will pay. The establishment strategy might feel satisfying in the short term. Excluding Caitlin Clark from graphics and conversations might provide momentary validation for preferred narratives, but the long-term consequences are becoming clearer every day. Every dollar of sponsorship revenue lost because brands doubt the league's commitment to maximizing engagement represents real damage. Every viewer who tunes out because coverage doesn't match what they want to see represents real loss. Every negotiation weakened by self-inflicted visibility wounds represents real cost. The bill is coming due. The bill is coming due. And the people responsible for running up the tab won't be the ones paying it. Players hoping for better contracts will pay. Teams struggling to compete financially will pay. Young girls dreaming of WNBA careers will pay through a league with diminished resources and reduced opportunities. All because some people couldn't accept that the sport's biggest moment arrived through channels they didn't control. There's a moment in every cultural conflict when the stakes become undeniable, when the abstract debates and theoretical discussions crystallize into something concrete and permanent, when everyone involved realizes that decisions made right now will echo for decades. The WNBA has reached that moment, and what happens over the next 18 months will determine the trajectory of women's professional basketball for a generation. Let's project forward, not with speculation, but with logical extrapolation based on observable trends and documented patterns. The 2025 WNBA season begins with unprecedented expectations. Caitlin Clark enters her sophomore campaign having already shattered rookie records and demonstrated that her impact wasn't a fluke. The league expects another surge in attendance. Networks anticipate continued ratings growth. Sponsors are positioned to capitalize on expanded interest. But Paige Bueckers also enters the league, the #1 overall pick. The player Sue Bird and establishment media have positioned as a future, the presumptive rival whose arrival was supposed to create compelling narratives and shared attention. This is where the establishment strategy faces its ultimate test. If Paige Bueckers immediately matches or exceeds Caitlin Clark's impact, the positioning makes sense. The emphasis on alternative stars becomes vindicated. The narrative about a diverse group of rising talents proves accurate. Everyone moves forward together. But what if that doesn't happen? What if Bueckers, talented as she undoubtedly is, experiences the normal adjustment curve that affects most rookies? What if the attention she generates, while substantial, doesn't approach Clark's documented numbers? What if the head-to-head comparison that establishment figures seem eager to promote ends up highlighting gaps rather than parity? The Dallas Wings, Bueckers' new team, finished the 2024 season with attendance figures that ranked in the middle of the pack. Respectable but unremarkable. When Clark's Fever visited Dallas, attendance spiked significantly above the home team's average. The market has already expressed preferences before Bueckers has played a single professional game. This creates enormous pressure on a rookie who hasn't asked for any of it. Paige Bueckers shouldn't have to carry the weight of establishment narratives on her shoulders. She should be allowed to develop at her own pace, find her professional footing, and build her career without being positioned as a counterweight to someone else's popularity. But that's not how the establishment has framed the situation. By elevating Bueckers so aggressively while minimizing Clark, they've set up comparison that serves nobody's interests except those invested in proving a point about who deserves attention. The 2025 season will force this comparison into the open. Every game will generate data points. Every attendance figure will tell a story. Every television rating will provide evidence. The narrative that establishment figures want to promote will collide with measurable reality in ways that can't be spun or explained away. And then come the 2026 WNBA All-Star Game and the early stages of 2028 Olympic preparation. USA Basketball will begin formalizing its approach to the Los Angeles Games. Training camps will be announced. Preliminary rosters will be discussed. The decisions that shape the final 12-player squad will start taking concrete form. This is where the establishment faces an impossible choice. Option 1. Include Caitlin Clark prominently in Team USA planning. Feature her in promotional materials. Build Olympic marketing around her documented ability to deliver audiences. Accept that the player establishment figure's work to marginalize has become essential to the success of a home soil Olympics. This option requires admitting that the previous approach was wrong. It means acknowledging that the Paris exclusion was a mistake. It demands accepting that media figures who spent years positioning alternatives misjudge what fans actually wanted. For people whose identities are tied to being right about women's basketball, this admission feels unthinkable. Option 2. Continue the marginalization campaign through Olympic preparation. Exclude Clark from early planning. Position other players as the faces of 2028. Attempt to redirect attention despite years of evidence showing the strategy doesn't work. This option maintains narrative consistency at the cost of competitive and commercial success. It prioritizes establishment preferences over measurable outcomes. It risks turning the most visible women's basketball event in American history into a referendum on whether institutional pettiness matters more than winning. Neither option is comfortable for the gatekeepers. Both require accepting losses they've spent years trying to avoid. The difference is that option 1 limits damage while option 2 guarantees it. What makes this situation so maddening for fans is how unnecessary the conflict has been from the start. Imagine an alternative timeline, one where establishment figures welcomed Caitlin Clark's arrival as a breakthrough everyone had been working toward, where legacy players celebrated new attention rather than questioning new fans, where media platforms highlighted all rising stars without conspicuously excluding any of them, where the focus stayed on growing the game rather than controlling who got credit for growth. In that timeline, everyone wins. Caitlin Clark wins because her talent gets proper recognition. Paige Bueckers wins because she enters a league with more resources and opportunities. Legacy players win because their contributions are valued as foundational. Media figures win because their platforms reach larger audiences. Sponsors win because their investments generate superior returns. Fans win because they get to enjoy great basketball without constant reminders of behind-the-scenes drama. That timeline was available. The establishment chose differently. Now everyone has to live with the consequences of that choice. The fractures, the tensions, the self-inflicted wounds that keep bleeding no matter how much spin gets applied. The question remaining is whether course correction is still possible, whether the establishment can swallow pride and embrace the moment, whether the next 3 years can repair damage rather than deepen it. The answer depends on something most analysts haven't fully considered, and it might determine everything. Here's what everyone is missing. The real power in this situation doesn't belong to Sue Bird. It doesn't belong to USA Basketball. It doesn't belong to legacy media figures or podcast platforms or establishment gatekeepers who believe their influence still shapes public opinion. The real power belongs to fans. It always has. And they're about to prove it in ways the establishment never anticipated. Think about what's happened over the past 2 years. Every time establishment figures tried to minimize Caitlin Clark, fans responded by showing up louder. Every snub generated more attention. Every exclusion created more headlines. Every attempt to redirect the narrative backfired spectacularly. The Streisand effect playing out in real time, over and over, with lessons that somehow never get learned. But passive resistance is only the beginning. What's coming next represents something far more significant. Organized, intentional, economically consequential action that the establishment cannot ignore. Fan communities are mobilizing, not in chaotic, unfocused ways that dissipate quickly, in strategic, coordinated efforts designed to maximize impact on the metrics that actually matter: viewership patterns, merchandise purchasing, social media engagement, sponsor feedback, the levers that translate fan sentiment into institutional consequences. Consider what happens if fans collectively decide to amplify certain content while ignoring others. If establishment media platforms that consistently minimize Caitlin Clark see their engagement numbers collapse, while independent creators covering her fairly experience explosive growth. If sponsors tracking brand sentiment Notice clear patterns in which coverage generates positive response and which generates backlash. These aren't hypotheticals. These are documented phenomena already occurring at scale. Sue Bird's podcast episodes that exclude Clark generate ratio patterns on social media that any analyst can observe. Comment sections fill with criticism. Engagement metrics skew negative. The algorithmic signals that determine future visibility register that audiences reject the content being offered. Meanwhile, independent coverage celebrating Clark's accomplishments spreads organically across platforms, reaching audiences that dwarf traditional media outlets. The market is speaking, loudly, consistently, unmistakably. The only question is whether anyone with institutional power is listening. Here's what the establishment still doesn't understand about modern media ecosystems. Gatekeeping only works when gates actually exist, when audiences have limited options, when information flows through controllable channels, when access requires permission from approved sources. None of those conditions apply anymore. Fans who feel underserved by establishment coverage create their own platforms. Viewers who disagree with mainstream narratives find communities that share their perspective. Consumers who reject messaging from traditional sources discover alternatives that better match their preferences. The gates are open. The walls are down. The monopoly on narrative is permanently broken. This is why the establishment's approach has been so counterproductive. Every effort to control the conversation has accelerated the fragmentation of the audience. Every attempt to promote preferred narratives has pushed fans toward independent voices. Every snub and exclusion has strengthened the very communities that challenge establishment authority. The harder they squeeze, the more slips through their fingers. Now multiply this dynamic across the next 3 years as the 2028 Olympics approach. Imagine the scrutiny that every USA basketball decision will face. Imagine the immediate viral response to any roster announcement that seems to prioritize establishment preferences over obvious merit. Imagine the commercial consequences if sponsors sense that institutional politics might compromise the visibility of their investments. The pressure is building, and there's no relief valve that doesn't require the establishment to change course. Here's the truth that Sue Bird and her allies need to accept. Caitlin Clark isn't going anywhere. Her talent is real. Her impact is documented. Her fan base is passionate and growing. No amount of podcast positioning or graphic exclusion will change the fundamental reality of what she brings to women's basketball. The choice facing the establishment isn't whether to acknowledge this reality. It's when, and whether that acknowledgement comes gracefully, as a course correction that preserves some credibility, or painfully, as an unavoidable capitulation forced by circumstances beyond their control. The fans have already decided what they want. They've demonstrated it through every measurable metric available. They've shown up at arenas. They've tuned into broadcasts. They've purchased merchandise. They've engaged with content. They've made their preferences clear in ways that cannot be misunderstood. What remains is for the establishment to catch up, to recognize that the moment they claim to want has arrived, even if it didn't arrive on their terms, to embrace growth rather than fighting over who gets credit for it, to stop treating fans as enemies to be delegitimized and start treating them as the lifeblood of the sport they supposedly love. Caitlin Clark will keep playing basketball. She'll keep breaking records. She'll keep filling arenas and drawing audiences and generating attention that elevates everyone around her. That's going to happen regardless of what Sue Bird says on her podcast or who gets included in which graphic. The only question is whether the establishment will spend the next 3 years fighting reality or accepting it, whether they'll waste energy on narrative control that no longer works or invest that energy in maximizing the unprecedented opportunity in front of them. The fans are watching. The sponsors are watching. The networks are watching. History is watching. The future of women's basketball is being written right now, not by gatekeepers on podcasts, not by establishment figures clinging to outdated influence, not by anyone who believes they can dictate what fans should care about. It's being written by the fans themselves, by their choices, their attention, their money, their passion, and they've already made their decision. The establishment can either get on board or get left behind. There is no third option. This is Courtside Leaks. We got every angle covered, every leak, Every backstage twist, every moment they won't show you. We're the home for truth behind the WNBA headlines. If this video opened your eyes, smash that like button. If you want to stay ahead of the stories the establishment doesn't want you to hear, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Drop a comment telling us what you think about Sue Bird's coverage. Share this video with every basketball fan who deserves to know what's really happening. The game is changing. Make sure you're not the last one to know. Stay locked in with Courtside Leaks. The real story is just getting started.